Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm so happy that you're back here listening with me, and I have a very special guest planned for today's episode. The guest is Miss Marina Williams. She's a licensed mental health professional, or licensed mental health counselor, I should say. And she's written a few books. And the book that I have her on to talk about today is the one with respect to toxic families and surviving toxic families, rather. And I think that you're going to find the podcast very informational. And I brought Marina on because of her expertise around discussing how she herself has managed her family dynamics, plus some of what she's written in the book without giving the content of the book away. So I hope that you find my interview with Marina helpful. Hello, Marina. Welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's awesome to have you on. I'm so excited for the show today with you. So, for my listeners who are listening to this show and may not be familiar with you, can you talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what drives the passion behind your work?
Yeah, so my name is Marina Williams. I am a licensed mental health counselor here in Boston, Massachusetts. I have written a few books, and I would say that my focus is relationships. It's in one of my books. I wrote that relationships is really the common denominator of all human experience, right? It really comes down to our relationships with other people. And that can be romantic relationships, it can be friendships, it can also be family members.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for you mentioned that you've written a few books. Can you tell us a little bit about the books that you've written?
Yes. So they're mostly guides for other therapists. I'd say my bestseller is Couples Counseling, a step-by-step guide for therapists. But I also wrote a book for lay people, which is called Surviving the Toxic Family, and that focuses on the family.
Mm. Ooh, and the reason why I had you on today, right, is to talk about toxic family. So for people that don't know, or that may, I guess, may wonder, or maybe thinking something like, "Oh gosh, it's very challenging to deal with my mother, my father, or my sister, or my brother," but they haven't exactly put a title on it, such as toxic. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to have a toxic family?
I think a lot of people really focus on, is this actually toxic or is it not? Am I being too sensitive? Am I misperceiving
Yes.
this person's behaviors, right? There's a lot of self doubt that goes
Yes.
into it. And I would say the fact that there is so much self doubt does point to perhaps there was a toxic upbringing,
Mm.
right? Because that's often a tactic with toxic families or even just toxic people in general, right? Like a lot of
Mhm.
abusive relationships are like that. They want you to doubt yourself, and having these experiences repeatedly does bring you to a place where you feel like you can't trust your own judgment anymore. So yes, for a lot of people, that question, I need to know definitively, is this a toxic family or not? Is my mother toxic or not? And a lot
Mhm.
of times that's what brings people to therapy, right?
Yes,
Like, is it just
absolutely.
me, or or is it this family, right? So a lot of people really struggle with that. And I think it's important to note that it's possible too that someone that's toxic for you may not be toxic for someone else. There may be situations where you yourself could be toxic for another person, right? So, there really isn't a definitive, is this person toxic or not, right? There are certainly toxic behaviors, toxic situations. And a lot of times though, you think about it, like what makes something toxic, right? A lot of times it's too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a family that's too protective, right? Protection's a good thing, but too protective
Yes,
is a toxic thing.
sure.
Too much freedom, right? Too much. And a lot of times people, maybe they'll shy away from saying my family's toxic, but they'll be able to say my family just feels like too much, right? And that can be an indication that there's some toxicity going on. A lot of times, control is a common denominator in toxic families. Is the family overly controlling? And that can look different to different people, right? Like we think of controlling families, you might think about the helicopter parent, right? It's not necessarily a helicopter parent, but there is definitely that control, that sense of hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually thinking about this a lot because last Friday I watched the re-airing of the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah. I don't know if you had a chance to see
I've
that.
seen bits and pieces of it. I haven't watched the entirety of it, but yes, I know exactly what you've been doing. I mean, all the buzz and all the rave on social media. And do share your thoughts about, if you care to
Yeah.
share your
Oh,
thoughts
yeah.
about the Harry Meghan interview and what your thoughts were about the allegations around the toxicity there.
Yes. So let me just say, I mean, obviously this is just one side of the story.
Sure,
Who knows? Who knows
sure.
what's going on? But I watched the interview, and I think anyone who has survived a toxic family, has experienced with toxic families, there's just a lot of stuff in that interview that rang true for them.
Yes,
First and foremost, the control and hierarchy.
yes.
Harry even referred to his family as being a business. He
I
said,
heard
look,
that.
it's a family business.
Hmm.
And they even called it the firm, a few different times. Instead of
Yes.
family, it was the firm.
Yeah.
And we've all heard stories about how working for a family business can be kind of toxic, right? We've all heard those anecdotes. So there's something about mixing family, right, with hierarchy and control that can get pretty toxic.
Mm.
And, they shared stories about how there's this hierarchy that even in private you have to curtsy to the queen, which I understand that's their tradition, right? But there are non-royal families where there's that same amount of unquestioning authority, and the family is run like a business, right? The business of running the family, where
Mm.
there's hierarchies even amongst the children, right? There's the
Hmm.
favorite one, and it kind of goes down the hierarchy. And even after we're all grown up and we're all adults capable of making our own choices, perhaps the matriarch or the patriarch of the family says, no, 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 no. Just because you're an adult doesn't mean that changes. We are going to keep that hierarchical structure. And what I say goes. And you're going to follow my edicts about what you do with your life. And what was interesting too about that interview was, like a lot of people, right? Harry said he actually didn't even see anything wrong with it until he got married. So an outsider comes into the family and sees what's going on and says, whoa, 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 this isn't normal, right? This isn't okay. I'm not okay with the way I'm being treated. I'm not okay with the way you're being treated. I'm not okay with the way our children are being treated. And his eyes were opened up to it. And the way that the family responded, allegedly, is, through this attack on Meghan. And we see that in toxic families, right? A lot of times people don't realize their family's toxic until they get married or they're dating someone
Oh,
who
yeah.
brings things out. And then the family then tries to push that person out because they see that their control is eroding, their
Yes.
influence is shifting onto the spouse, and they don't want that. They don't want to share their influence over the child, the adult child.
So very true. And even I would even go so far as to say the public backlash from the interview, about, all of these celebrities saying that Megan is this, she's that, she's a liar, she's coming from a place of privilege, she doesn't appreciate what she's been given, blah, blah, blah. She's brainwashing Harry. That, even that parallels what goes on inside a toxic
Mhm.
family where you have outsiders or extended family that kind of come back and say those very same things. So that's very interesting, that parallel there. Yeah, where they come back and say, oh, well, you don't appreciate being a part of the family business, or you don't appreciate what your parents did for you. They gave you everything. What are you complaining about? Sort of thing. So it's very interesting then. And, even with them questioning her depression. What do you got to be depressed about? That's
Mhm.
very similar, also, I think. So that I think that's a perfect analogy. And again, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I do think that that is a perfect analogy for what people go through on a day to day. With that being said, though, you brought up something that strikes me, and I know that a lot of people ask this. How do I know if my family is toxic or if I'm the toxic one?
Ooh, yeah. Well, right. You know how you feel, right? You know that you leave these interactions in tears. You know what that feels like.
Mm-hmm.
You also need to understand that you yourself know what's real, right? You have to trust that your perception of reality is accurate.
Mm.
And something that can help is taking a break, right? Stepping back, because look, even if it is you, let's say it is you and that you're the toxic person, it can be helpful in that case for you to take a break to keep you from, hurting other people, that cycle of hurting and then regret
Sure.
and that kind of thing. So even if it's true that you are the toxic person,
Sure.
it can help you to take a break from that situation. And I think that the fact that you are examining yourself, the fact that you are approaching it with some awareness and saying, well, let me think about what I'm doing and what I'm bringing to the situation, actually does speak to a level of non-toxicity, right? A lot of times, one of the defining traits of toxicity is that the person does not take any responsibility. They're
Mm.
not looking at themselves. They're not willing to change. Look, we all have things about ourselves that is toxic, right? Like I
Yes.
look back on the high school years and I cringe. I look back on those early relationships. God bless them. They made me a better person. I learned from
Sure.
them. And, now my spouse gets to reap the benefits, but I feel bad for those people. There's things that we all need to learn and change about ourselves all the time. And the fact that you're willing to take that journey and put that critical eye on yourself says that perhaps you're more human and not so toxic. Maybe it's the
Mm.
person who's not willing to look at what they're doing that is perhaps more toxic.
Absolutely. And then I would also, I think that that's a great point that you make, but I think that a lot of people start to question whether or not they're toxic or not when they've been gaslit
Mhm.
or coerced or, just manipulated in some way to be told that they are the ones that are toxic or they are the ones with the problem. And I see that over and over again.
Yes.
Marina, what about the people who say, my family is toxic. So what? You know, I'm they're the only family I got. What am I gonna do with that? What can I do?
Yeah.
They're all I got. What do you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, if they're all you've got, that's something to work on in therapy, right? That's something to work on to get some other supports for you.
Mm-hmm.
You should never be in a situation where that's all you have, right? We all should have a community outside of our immediate family, of friends, neighbors, it might be church groups for some people, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
You need to work on strengthening that community of support for yourself. And I think that unfortunately, right, we see this in abusive relationships all the time. They purposefully, as a tactic of control, get people so that they can't turn to anyone else, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
all you have. You'll have nothing if you walk away. We see that in oh gosh, we see that in religious cults a lot of the time too. If you
Mm-hmm.
leave, you're going to be totally disowned,
Mm-hmm.
excommunicated, and then you'll have nothing. And some people have to get to that point, right, where they have to walk away and actually have nothing and then build things back up for themselves.
Absolutely. Um, but what about those people who do rely on their family for everything? For example, you brought up the family business, right? What if your family is, in which I see a lot also, people that are financially dependent on their family? How, what are some things that they could do to sort of uncouple themselves from that dependency?
Yeah, and it is something that you see a lot as a therapist, right? The young adult who is, completely financially dependent on their
Mm-hmm.
parent. They're living in their parents'
Mm-hmm.
home.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I would see situations where, maybe they weren't necessarily a young adult anymore, but, they were living in an apartment that was owned by the parent. And there's just, this huge amount of financial control. I've even seen it where the only thing financially that the family has on the person is that they're on a family cellular plan and they're using that to
To hold over you.
hold over the person. And for me, it's easy for me to say, we'll just cancel and switch
Mm-hmm.
to another plan.
Mm-hmm.
But people use that, even something so minor like that. I've seen people use that to have control over their family member. And here's the thing, it's like the golden handcuffs, right? You may have a family that maybe they're quite wealthy and they're holding, that inheritance over you. And you really do have something to lose here, more than just, a $50 a month cell plan, right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
could be something, and that's something significant. And you do have to make that choice. For a lot of people, I would say having your independence is more valuable than any kind of financial dollar that you can put on it. Now, I know that that's easier said than done, and
Yeah.
it's not like you can just immediately become financially independent. Obviously, that's a journey. I also recognize that, for a lot of these young adults, their journey to financial independence has been purposefully sabotaged. I've seen that time and time again. Their confidence has been eroded. They're too socially anxious to go out there and fill out applications. They might even be too socially anxious to go to the grocery store and get their own groceries because their confidence has been so eroded by this family. We've seen that, and that's a difficult journey. And I would say, you know, talk to someone, really get out there. If you're in that situation where it's that controlling, there are there are still options. I know someone who went off to the military, and that was a way to, even then his parents
Mm.
tried to
Wow.
get control of his payments from the military, but he was able to walk around that. There are options for people to, the classic one is to go away for college, right? Out of states, you're living on campus, give yourself a couple years to get things set up for yourself in the new state, get a job, etc. It takes a lot of determination to do that, a lot. If you're that controlled, it really does take a lot of determination, a lot of hard work to get to that place where you can walk away. It's not easy. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy. It's not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I realized too that we're also talking about US based norms, right?
Mhm.
Because there are, and I don't know what your experience or expertise is in this arena and working with families that are not based in the US or have non-traditional US based norms. So, for example, there are many cultures in which there's a lot of pressure
Mm.
to stay within a family, whether it's toxic or not. And that could be whether it's like it's an arranged marriage or it's just whatever the case may be, that there's pressure that you have to conform to that family's norms. And, people will actually enact violence in order for you to kind of fall in line with that family.
Yeah, and I think situations like that is especially tough because, let's say you are able to walk away from that situation. You may not just be walking away from a marriage, from your immediate family, you may be walking away from your entire community.
Yeah, and that can be tough. And that could even be, like you said, such as religious communities. I've seen it where women have gotten excommunicated from their churches. And, once you get that, the family can't have anything to do with you and all those kind of things. So there's lots of different levels and ways that this can go. Huh. I guess my question to you is how, if we want to have some semblance, if you have people that want to have some semblance of a relationship with their family, right? They're just not ready to let go, or they can't let go for whatever the reason. How can they manage the toxicity?
Yeah, there are some situations where it's an easy choice, right, to walk away from the family or the particular family member, right? There are some situations where it's cut and dry. There are other situations where, it's so agonizing for the person that they have to choose, do I choose a little bit of toxicity or, the grief and anguish of
Mm-hmm.
walking away, right? It might be more painful that person to walk away than to just stay and deal with whatever they have to deal with. For people like that, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book, there are things you can try to do, right? You can try to troubleshoot it. This is going to sound like a strange analogy, but it was told to me by someone, and I think it works. When you're in the grocery store and you get like the grocery cart, and maybe it has like a bad wheel, and every time you push it forward, it kind of like steers left,
Yeah.
right? So you learn if I push forward, it's going to steer left. So I need to overcompensate and actually push a little right, and then it goes forward.
Yeah.
You can kind of think of people as being like this grocery cart, right? Like you kind of learn, like I gotta steer right with this person if I want things to go straight. And with a lot of family members, that may mean avoiding certain topics of conversation, right? Like you just know it's going to go in a bad way if I do that. It may mean an information diet, right? That's something I highly recommend, is to not tell them about particularly emotionally charged things with your life where they're going to weigh in on it, where they're going to criticize. Just don't even tell them about it, which I know that can actually feel really sad for people, the fact
Mm-hmm.
that they can't
Sure.
share certain things with their family. But
Yeah.
it, unfortunately, with some families, it's just the
Yeah.
way it is. There are things that I don't share with my family. There are things, let's say I want to do something, I tell them about it after I've already done it.
Mm. Mm.
And that way no one's weighing in. It's, hey, this happened, right? It can sound kind of strange to people, like, oh, you're keeping secrets. Are these people supposed to be supportive? There's a lot of things that are supposed to be, but just aren't. And that is part of
Absolutely.
growing older and wiser, as you accept that some things just are the way they are and you can't change it. So an information diet is, probably the first thing you want to look into. Another thing is, with some families, it's like the length of time. Maybe the first couple hours are good, but then once people get comfortable, it starts getting, more critical, more toxic, right? So you learn, like, okay, well, maybe I can do an afternoon with my mother, but I can't go on vacation with her.
Mm.
Another thing you can look at too is combinations of people. A lot of toxic families are much better on a one-on-one basis. There's something about getting them all together that those old patterns, that old system gets activated, so to speak. And, if you're someone that in your family, you're like at the bottom of the totem pole, you get the whole totem pole together, and sure enough, you're on the bottom again. But
Mm,
one-on-one, it might be a different situation. So that's
mm,
something to look into too. If there's not an audience, they might actually treat you respectfully.
mm.
So that's something to look into. So there's different things you can try to make it work, limiting time, and also, limiting like the situations and limiting the conversation, which I know a lot of people listening are going to say, well, it sounds like there's like a lot of limitations here. And is that a family? Well, it's a lot. It is a lot to do. And there's something that's actually painful about having to do all that, right?
Yeah,
Like, that's also painful. And it's really about just creating that balance of what is the least harmful to you. Some people are going to do this, right? They're going to be like, all right, I'm going to limit what information I give them. I'm going to start limiting contact. If my mother calls me, I'm not going to call her back right away, and I'm going to tell her I'm busy and keep the phone call short, right? They're going to start doing these things. And after a while, they may find that they get tired of doing all that, and they may decide that, you know, maybe that they do feel ready to walk away from the family, or maybe this is working and they want to keep it this way.
mm.
So it's going to be different things to different people and what works for them and what they're able to do and what they're capable of doing.
Sure, sure. There's a couple of questions I have. You know, I know there's people out there that are listening and they're thinking, oh, I know my family's toxic and I want us all to go to therapy.
Hmm.
When should the toxic family go to therapy versus when should you not try to go to therapy with your toxic family?
Yeah. Um, so when should they? They
Yeah.
probably should have back when you were a kid. That's probably when they should have done it. The fact that it hasn't happened yet, and you're how old, right? Kind of
Yeah.
kind of shows you that there's not a lot of self-awareness going
Sure.
on. So I'm not a family therapist.
Sure.
I've done couples counseling, which some people might think that's pretty similar, but I disagree.
Hmm.
Possibly a really talented family therapist could help turn this situation around, but I think with like a toxic family where, especially if you have a situation where everything gets blamed on you, I would worry about the family therapy session turning into, let's all blame Natalie or let's all
Yeah.
blame Marina,
Yeah.
and you having to just sit there and professionally take it from these people.
Yeah.
And I think like a really talented family therapist could help you rein that in. But Natalie, me and you both know, like, we're both therapists, like we're not all powerful. We can try to rein it in as best we can, but there comes to a point where if someone is just hell bent on
Sure.
being toxic, or their toxicity is so ingrained, they're not going to be able to be cured by the family
Yeah.
session, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree, and I would even take it a step further to say that at least 2 to 3 people need to be willing and motivated to look at the
Yes.
issue as opposed to playing the blame game. And again, I think you hit the nail on the head. It has to be someone that's really talented in sort of managing all the dynamics that can come up in the room. And sometimes that's not always possible. Um, what about, if you have those outside influences that are pressuring you to stay within the toxic family or to suck it up
Oh,
or that are
exactly.
minimizing. Yeah, how does one manage those? Do you have any sort of advice or feedback, I should say, about how to manage those?
I think that a lot of those, outside influences, and it could be different people depending on the situation, right? It could be like perhaps a more distant relative, so still part of the family. It could be, a church person. There are some people that have like power and influence over families without necessarily being part of the family. I think, especially anyone who tells someone to suck it up, it takes so much courage and so much strength to both survive within a toxic family, and then also if someone does choose to walk away, it takes incredible strength to walk away, and it's not something that anyone does lightly. No
Yeah.
one is just flippantly ending relationships with people in their family. No one's doing that. It's only after extreme adversity that something like that happens. So anyone who says suck it up, it's like, look, if that was a possibility, that person would be doing that. They are walking away because that's not a possibility for them. They've hit a wall with what they can put up with this family.
Mhm.
It's incredibly painful to go through. I also think a lot of times people that sort of meddle and get involved, it may be that they're projecting their own fears about how expendable they
Sure.
are. And they might be worried that if um, people are leaving the family, then people might start leaving them soon, right? Like they might
Mhm.
be dealing with their own fears and insecurities that are being projected onto your situation. But, that term, suck it up, I don't think anyone should ever say that to anyone.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
yeah,
I
it's really
agree.
up to the person, what they're able to
Yeah,
tolerate.
absolutely. And those outside influences could also have their own agenda too, but I totally agree with you. What are sort of some of the signs that we can see within ourselves if we've been in a toxic family? What are some of those things that maybe show up in our own relationships or some of our own challenges that we could start to notice within ourselves and say, oh, you know, I- that might be coming from, you know, my family stuff.
Oh, yeah, especially like if you have a pattern of poor relationships just in general, right? Like if you've had a lot of like frenemy situations, if you've had a hard time with romantic relationships, right? Like that ability to form and sustain relationships, we learn that as children from our primary relationship, right? Our relationship with our parent, and then later on with our siblings and extended relatives. And if that relationship was toxic and you've internalized that toxicity, you're going to find that this is just an ongoing pattern for you in your life.
Mm.
A phrase I've heard from clients again and again, and it's real, this line of thinking is just really reflective of that, of a toxic upbringing. They'll say something to the effect of, I don't know what it is about me, but if I did know what it is, I would change it. But there must just be something about me that is off-putting to other people. There's something about me. I don't know what it is, but it makes people not like me. It makes people mistreat me, right? And they have this lifelong pattern
Mhm.
of, being rejected, being abused, being mistreated, being taken advantage of. And a lot of people will look at that and say, well, I'm the common denominator. Well, yeah, you're always the common denominator in your own life, right? You're always there. That's going to be true with everything that happens in your life. You are the common denominator, but that doesn't mean that you're the cause. People decide that they are the cause when potentially the toxic family is the cause. And the toxic family, to some degree, they know that they're toxic. They know that this is not working and that this isn't right. And as a defense mechanism, so that they don't have to feel bad about the things they've done and the choices they've made, a lot of times they will put it on the child, right? Well, if not for this kid who misbehaves, who is bad, whatever, right? This family wouldn't be toxic. So they'll all come together and they'll often just blame one kid, or maybe it'll be a couple kids, but the blame gets put on that kid. And at the time, a lot of these kids know it's not them, right? They start acting out, which is a way of saying like, hey, this isn't me. Does anyone notice how toxic this is? But even a really willful child over time can get beaten down and just weathered by this message, this nonstop message, you're the problem, you're the problem. And they internalize that toxicity. And then they move through life in such a way where they find themselves inadvertently attracted to partners that will also treat them like the problem, to workplace cultures where they're the problem, to friends that are not real friends, that are people who just experience, I don't know, some kind of schadenfreude at their own misery, and that's why they have them as a friend. And once you do heal, you look back on these friendships, these past relationships, and you're like, oh my God, I can see it so clearly now. It wasn't me, it was these people. And it might not even be that they're choosing these people. It might be that these people are choosing them, right? That these people are seeking you out. So, even that, like, please don't take too much responsibility for this. It may be that these people are finding you and they are seeking you out.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And gosh, I hate that I can't remember her name, but I had a lady on my podcast that wrote The Energy Vampires. And she talked about how those people you are just like a magnet. Those people just pick her up like a magnet. Like it doesn't matter. She could be in a room full of people, and those toxic people are just drawn to her. It's almost like a magnet, so much so that she has to have other people in her life to help assess and flesh out whether or not these are good people to have around or not. Um, yes, I'll think of her name. It'll come to me at the oddest time. But anyhow, how internally, how does one let go? You spoke about that. How did internally, what's your advice for how someone lets go of the power of the toxic family, what they have over them, so that they're not drawn to toxic people and toxic situations?
Yeah. So when you're healing from a toxic family, when you're surviving the toxic family, there's some phases that people go through, right? And we talked about that first phase, which is you're blaming yourself, right? To some degree, you believe there's something that's unlovable about you or inherently damaged about you. You're weird, you're whatever, right? And it causes people to react in a way that is abusive towards you, right? So that's phase one. You're taking on all the blame. And during that time, you will find that even though you've moved away from your toxic family, you've grown up, right? Maybe your parents have passed away, but you're still finding yourself in these toxic situations. So it's hard for you to understand how it could be due to that toxic upbringing, right?
Absolutely.
And that's where a lot of people get stuck. Well, I'm the common denominator here, right? And they're not realizing that, again, like the energy vampires, they get attracted to that.
Yes.
Phase two, right? So phase one is you blame yourself. Phase two is you start to understand trauma. You start to understand toxic families. Probably a lot of the people listening are in phase two, right? They're getting that understanding. They're doing some research about it. And they're understanding that it wasn't their fault. And they're understanding that a lot of the situations they found themselves in as adults were also not their fault because they were trauma responses to having grown up in that toxic family, right? So the responsibility is getting shifted from themselves to the family of origin or a particular parent, if that's the case. So the responsibility shifts from themselves onto other people. This can also be problematic, though. Although I would say that phase 2 is better than phase 1, it can also be problematic because there's a lot of anger in phase 2, and there's just tons of resentment. And this can also cause problems in future relationships or friendships or what have you, because when you're not accepting responsibility, this can be really off-putting to people.
Mm.
Right? Like all the responsibility is being shifted onto the abuser. And I'm not saying you should take responsibility for the abuse. God, no. But there is a certain amount of responsibility for your life, right? We're all responsible for
Mm.
our own life. And when you're not taking responsibility for your life, that's really off putting to people. And in phase 2, you're also going to have rejection experiences. It's going to be a little more subtle than phase 1, but there's still going to be that rejection. And eventually, people start to analyze that. They start to think about that. They start to wonder about that. Well, wait, I thought this was healing, right? But it doesn't seem like my healing journey is complete. I still have all sorts of anger. I'm still having relationship problems with
Yes.
other people, and that moves them into phase 3. And phase 3 is when you accept that what happened to you was abusive. It wasn't okay. You didn't deserve it. You accept that the things that happened afterwards was because, you were still on a healing journey. It also wasn't your fault. It was a trauma response. But you take responsibility for your life from this day forward. And if you still experience difficulties moving forward, you think about that situation. Okay, what happened here? Is this something I can change? What can I do to change it? And you keep working on yourself. And that's what healing looks like, right? You have an understanding of the abuse. You also have an understanding of yourself, and you keep working on yourself and you keep growing as a person.
Okay.
And the anger will go away. You'll find that like that intense anger will start to go away once you take responsibility. Anger is a natural response to feeling like other people have control over your life and other people are doing things to you that's outside of your control. Once you take back that control, that intense anger and resentment will start to melt away, and you'll start to be able to experience some peace. And you'll find that your relationships with other people are better. You'll find that, you might get a new job and now you're in a workplace with a more healthy work culture. Things are going to start changing for you. And it's amazing the ripple effects it can have, just changing the way you think.
That is a great reminder for a lot of folks out there that are just sort of trapped in despair or in a
Mm-hmm.
cycle and they just don't know how to get out. I think one of the things, and maybe you could speak to this, is as you're starting to come out, if someone's going to take your feedback, they're going to read your book and go through those steps. As you start to try to come out or separate yourself from the toxicity, there's almost always fallout, right, from the family, or there's just this misunderstanding, or there's just this desire for them to try to reel you back in or get you to fall back in
Mm-hmm.
line. And I know that a lot of people get stuck there. Do you have some tips or pointers on how to get through that piece of it where there's just sort of this like backlash from the family?
So I think the important thing is to remember boundaries. And a lot of people get confused about boundaries because they think boundaries are like the rules you have for other people. And that's not what boundaries are. Boundaries are the rules you have for yourself,
Absolutely.
the type of behavior you're okay with coming from yourself, and the type of behavior that you will just sit through and deal with, right? And
Mhm.
everyone has boundaries to some extent. And it's really about maintaining your own dignity. You
Mm.
know, what is a dignified response? And I see this all the time. I live on a busy street in Boston, and sometimes I look out my window here and you'll see a couple getting to a fight. And looking out my window, I can't tell which one of them respects themselves. It looks like neither, right? But if you see a situation where someone is arguing and the other person doesn't argue back, they just walk away, it's really clear who the good guy is, right? It's the person who's walking away. And that's important to remember. They're going to try to hook you back in, and they're going to try to get you to default to, a childlike version of your behavior, right? They're going to try to trigger you back into, you're that scared 6-year-old or that tantruming 6-year-old
Sure.
again. But you're not going to do that. You're going to have a dignified response. You're going to walk away, and you're going to maintain those boundaries of what's acceptable for you. The other thing that I would advise people is, if you are in a situation where you decide you want to walk away, a lot of times what people will do is they will write like a really long letter or email and send it to the person. I really advise against that. I advise against lengthy text messages.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do it. Don't do it for several reasons. One is I think it invites debate, because you're saying I'm walking away because of X, Y, and Z, and then they'll say, well, X, Y, and Z never happened, and there's just like this argument that happens
Mm-hmm.
in this debate, and it's not up for debate. This is you and this is your life. So I would advise against sending the
Absolutely.
letter or the email. I think a lot of times that letter or email is going to get passed around to various people. It might even get published online. You can't expect this person to respect your confidentiality or your privacy. Just don't do it. It's just going to look bad. I also think that if you have like this kind of final blowout with someone before walking away, this might sound a little controversial, but if at some point you want to rejoin the family, it's going to make things kind of awkward for you to come back. And a lot of people, when they go no contact with a family member, it often is just for a few months, right? They think it's going to be forever, but a lot of times it's just for a few months. And even if it's for years, there might be that time when you come back. You may decide that you don't want to be part of your toxic family, but you might still want to go to a wedding. If there's a funeral, you might want to still go to. It makes it really hard for you to modify your participation with that family if you have this big blowout. So I would advise against it. I have a sister whom I haven't spoken to in 8 years.
Mm.
There was not a big blowout. I just kind of faded out. And I honestly think that was the best way to do it. I don't see myself going back into her life, but it makes things less dramatic if at some point, I did run into her at, say like again, a wedding or a funeral or
Yeah.
whatever. And there's also no ammunition for her to say, oh, look at this
Right.
email that was sent to me, or these terrible things that were sent to me that
Right.
aren't true. It just makes things less dramatic, and I think it minimizes fallout. Another strategy you could do is, let's say someone who's listening to this is thinking, I don't think my family would let me fall out. They would well, not let me fall out, but let me fade out. They would pursue me,
Yeah.
right? They would keep harassing me or calling me. If that's the case, you could just try asking for some space. Like, hey, And you could even do the it's not you, it's me strategy. You could say, things are really stressful at work right now, or things are really stressful with, whatever it is, and just ask for some space and see how far you can stretch that space out. That space may turn into a new pattern of behavior where you're able to have more distance from them and you're comfortable with that amount of distance.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this has been very, very helpful. Marina, where can the listeners find you if they want to reach out to you or contact you for any reason?
Well, I am on LinkedIn. I don't have a website right now,
Yeah.
but if people want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, they can. My books are on Amazon. It's Marina Williams, LMHC. You'll find me.
Okay. I'll definitely put them in the show notes. And for people that are listening, can you tell us again the titles of your books or the books that you have out so that people, if it like resonates with them, they could be sure to pick that up?
Yeah. So if you really resonated with today's topic,
Yeah.
feel free to pick up my book, Surviving the Toxic Family. I've written some other books, but they're really more geared towards the professional. I
Yeah.
know from the Amazon reviews that some people that read them are not therapists and they still find some value in them.
Yeah.
But in terms of just lay people, feel free to read Surviving the Toxic Family.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate all of the excellent tips that you provided the listeners today.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts were on the interview with Marina. And as always, let's keep the conversation going. If you're on this YouTube video, please do like, share, and make a comment below. If you're following the podcast on your podcast player, please remember to provide support by liking and subscribing. And then, if you want to send me an email, a date with darkness at gmail.com is the way to go. Or, you can always comment on Instagram and Facebook accounts as well, which are also in the show notes below. And if you find that you're looking for support for yourself, and you're healing from your own relationships that are unhealthy, or you're also we also want to support people that are healing from unhealthy relationships. Please come on over to a Date with Darkness Facebook group as well. So until next time, thank you so much for listening. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and be well.